Our final speaker tonight is Reverend Dave Ostendorf. So let's please welcome him. He'll give us some remarks.
Good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. I'm honored to be here and to have been invited to this gathering. I honor all of you for being here. I'm grateful to IATP for this, once again, a very creative response to emerging realities in this state and country. Thankful to Garat for his leadership in organizing this conference, and look forward to our conversations tonight and tomorrow. I'm glad to be here with you with my own colleague, Sakura Felton, who is with me tonight. I'm with her, I should say. She's our new organizer from this summer over in the Wilmer area for our Midwest Immigrant Health Project, working with the workforce over in that whole area just to the south of here around a wide range of health issues. And I hope you'll get acquainted with her as she continues her work here. Our organization works across the country in many, many communities and settings. And we have in the Midwest and Plain States, particularly in recent years, been working in quite a number of meatpacking communities. And I've been invited to spend a little bit of time with you tonight to really kind of begin to attempt to frame, if you will, to set a larger context around the emerging realities of our work and community life, particularly in meatpacking and poultry processing communities. And to do that, I really want to kind of have you, invite you to a little bit of a historical journey with me so that we can come down to the present day to understand some of the situations that all of us are now facing in the packing house communities in which we live and work, and particularly in this region. I want to have a very frank conversation with you about a topic that most Americans don't want to talk about: race. Race. The meatpacking industry in this country, more than any other industry that I know of, has perfected a system of exploiting race for 120 years. It began back in the south side of Chicago in the late 1890s and 1880s, and it continues to this day in the packing house communities many of you are working with, are living in. From 1870 to about 1890, 8 million foreign-born immigrants came to this country. And in the city of Chicago, which became the main packing house community for the entire nation, the city of Chicago's population doubled with immigrants during that period of time. On the south side of Chicago, some of you know, was the largest packing house site in the entire country, a square mile of packing houses down there, employing thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of workers. And what the meatpackers found early on was that they could bring in and they could hire immigrant workers from many different places who spoke many different languages, came from many different cultures, and effectively pit them against one another on the packing house lines. And they did this extremely effectively in the late 19th century, 120 years ago. They perfected a class system also within the packing industry so that Germans and Bohemians and others sort of occupied the upper strata of the packing house workers, and other Eastern Europeans kind of did the grunt work, the dirty work, kind of at the bottom of the worker scale. And they took advantage of the situation where people couldn't communicate with one another because of language barriers, and they simply developed a workforce that they could handle and exploit to their own ends at whatever degree they wished. In the late 1890s and early 20th century, packing house workers began to organize into unions. And the unions were very strong, and they, over a period of about 10 years, engaged in quite a number of strikes. And what the packers did during that period of time was that it brought in African Americans, black workers, to break the strike. And in 1994, one of the worst strikes in the entire industry, basically emptied the packing houses, and they brought in over 10,000 strikebreakers, African Americans, to fill the jobs of predominantly white people. You can only imagine what happened. The terrible racial conflict that emerged from that period of time lingered for decades and decades. And black workers in South Chicago were put upon by white workers and the Irish and others. In 1918, there was a horrific and deadly riot in Chicago that was really fomented by white Irish workers against the African American community, largely as a result of the Packers' influence in the workforce. It's important that we understand this context for today, because this context has lasted for 120 years. The meatpacking industry in this country in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, went through a massive transformation. It left Chicago, and the South Side Chicago stockyards shut down in 1971, and they all came out to the countryside, here in Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, and set up their plants, and they set them up in non-union territories so they didn't have to deal with the unions. And in spite of that, however, the unions by mid-20th century were very strong and worked together to really advance workers' rights. But an interesting thing happened in the 1980s, and this has very direct bearing on us today. In the 1980s, during another period of economic turmoil in this country, union wages were broken in the packing industry. The packing industry had very strong union wages in the 1980s, up until 1982 and 85. In 1982, my friends, in 1982, 26 years ago, a packing house worker could make between $12 and $16 an hour in 1982 dollars. $12 and $16 an hour. I venture to say very few packing house workers are making that kind of money today in 2008 dollars. The entire industry was broken in terms of its wage structure, and by the late 1980s, the packers began to go back to what they had perfected in the late 19th century, a hiring system based on immigrants and a hiring system based on race. And so today, 62% of the workforce in the meatpacking industry in this country is black or Latino. 62%, and I think it's actually higher because those are some dated numbers. And so by the late 80s and early 1990s, the workforce became heavily Latino. And then we began to see Southeast Asian workers come into the picture, and then with African diaspora in recent years, many of our African colleagues who are also working in the packing and processing industry, poultry, and red meat. That has set up a situation of real conflict or potential conflict in these packing house communities. Our organization worked in Emporia, Kansas for a number of years. Some of you may know friends from Emporia because that plant shut down last January after many years of operation. In 2006, Tyson started bringing in Somali workers. Some of you may have been in Emporia or have friends who worked in Emporia. And in 2006, about 400 to 600 Somalis came into Emporia. And immediately, guess what happened?